Hi, wonderful people. I'm Leah Rapaner. As a sociologist, University of Melbourne professor, founder of the Gender Equity Initiative, director of the Future of Work Lab, woman, wife, and mother, I've made it my life's mission to take down every ridiculous gender myth out there. Together, we'll deep dive into the research to get to the bottom of all these misperceptions that are holding all of us back. Don't worry, I've studied these types of questions for decades, and after publishing countless articles exactly on these topics, I know when they are nonsense or real truths. And I'm going to help you learn that too. So here we go. Let's do it. This is Misperceived. On today's podcast, I'm going to talk to you about, will future generations achieve household equity? Basically, will we close the chore gap through our daughters? What happened in your family? When you look back at your life, you compare yourself to your mother or your grandmother or your father or your grandfather. Are you seeing that you're doing housework differently? And what about your partner? Are they doing housework differently? Are you seeing actually that the generational gap in housework is closing for you? When I look back at my life, I had a grandmother who stayed at home. She was part of a generation that really wasn't allowed to work. The norms were different. And I'm going to tell you that the rumors were that she was a terrible cook. She had to do all the housework. She had to do all the childcare, but I think she loathed it. So she cooked things quickly. She cooked them on high heat. She burnt them, and then the whole family had to eat them. Not because she was a good cook, but because she was a woman. She spent her days painting the walls with chalk. Serious story. My dad would come home from school, elementary school, and the walls would be covered with chalk art. And everyone was told not to touch it. But of course, she then had to clean that wall only to paint again. In my house, I would say I don't know that I've achieved equity. I have a more equal division than perhaps previous generations, but I don't think it's on parity. And I'm like many couples where actually it's very hard to get total parity. It's very hard to do things different when we have really strict and strong gender roles. And I'm actually, like most of the research, have a child, a daughter, who doesn't probably contribute enough. I mean, we ask her to do everything. She's asked to cook. She's asked to paint. She's asked to hammer. She's asked to demolish stuff when we do it all. But do I think that she's doing her fair share? Probably not. But maybe we aren't either. My house is messy, y'all. It's messy, messy, messy. So come on over and hang out. But what I'm going to tell you is I'm like many people right now where housework has gotten more equal over time, but in part because women are doing less housework. We are just living messier lives. So what does all of this mean? Like, are we going to see over time that gender gaps in housework close, or is it a misperception that actually all we need is the next generation of women to come through to do less and the next generation of men to do more? Will generational gaps in housework close, or are we doomed to be stuck with inequality forever? So on this episode of Misperceived, we're going to unpack the myth that our daughters will be better off than we will in terms of the gender gap in housework. This is exactly the question that Brendan Churchill at the University of Melbourne, Sabina Cornrich at NYU Abu Dhabi, and I asked in our 2023 article in Social Science Research. What we were interested in is whether generational shifts will close the gender gap in unpaid work. Like, will each generation coming through be more egalitarian, be more equal sharing, have men who do more and women who do less? And will that close the gaps? And if that's true, then this is a really easy solution, right? We just need to hang tight. We don't have to do anything. We just have to socialize our daughters a little bit different, socialize our sons a little bit different, and slowly over time, we'll all become egalitarian. And this is a problem that is no longer a problem. Easy peasy, done and closed. And we were really interested in looking at what happens when we compare, say, baby boomers' housework for parents to those who are in the Gen X generation and those who are in the Gen Z generation. And there's kind of a reason to do this because what's happening in the sociological research is that there's this argument about whether our gender revolution is stalled or whether it's just slow. So Paula England talks about these stalled gender revolutions. And the basic idea is that you start to see this huge momentum. You start to see that women gain power, women gain access to education, women gain access to employment, and men start to do more in the domestic sphere. And then it hits a point in which everything just stalls. So we have incredible momentum, say 1970, 1980, 1990, and then there's a stalling. And what Paula England shows is that there is this stall. There's this stall in terms of education, there's a stall in terms of employment, and there's a stall in the gender pay gap. It's this idea that you get momentum and then it hits a threshold. And that last 30%, that last 20% of parity is really difficult to get. And so there's a question about, are we in the midst of a gender revolution still? Or has it stalled? Has it stopped? This is her argument. Stalled. This is counter to another argument that's coming from Oriel Sullivan at Oxford University, where she's saying, actually, it's not stalled. It's just that the gender revolution is slow. So when we look at what's happening, it's tiny little drips of change. And those come generationally. So you don't know if it's slow or you don't know if it's stalled because you have to wait for this next generation to enter adulthood. We don't know yet. But when we look across generations, we start to see more parity. We start to see people who have different ideologies. They interact with institutions. They ask for different things. So I'm going to tell you what we found. We took the American Time Use Survey. And so this is a representative sample of US people. And what they ask them is, how did you spend a day, a given day, minute by minute, and they document their time. And what's neat about the American Time Use Survey is because it's been collected for such a long period of time that we can get kind of the ages when they overlap. We can see millennials when they are the same age as Gen X. And we can see Gen X when they're the same age as the boomers. So we can actually compare someone in the same generation at the same age and see, what does their housework look like? What does their childcare look like? What does their paid employment look like? So if you think about the baby boomers, they're the start of that gender revolution. They are some of the first generations to go to higher education and high rates. They are some of the first generations to access high status positions, political positions. And so they're this really critical generation that kind of pushes the boundaries into higher education, employment, and power. But they're also interesting because they're still pretty traditional. You still see that mothers do more of the housework. You still see these kind of traditional attitudes. You still see an expectation of breadwinner and homemaker. Then comes the Gen X. This is what scholars often call this hybrid generation. They're interesting because they are looking to their mothers. Usually their mothers are baby boomers who have had some sort of catalyst moment in, but also traditionalism. And they also are looking to chart their own course, to do things differently, to access education at higher levels, to stay in employment, to expect equity within their partnerships, to be present for their children, to do things different than the other generation. And then coming behind them are the millennials. They're interesting too because they're one of the first generations to say they really do expect equity in childcare, employment, and housework. And they want things to be equal. But the problem for them is that they have experienced an incredible amount of economic disruption. So you can want equity, you can want to be sharing with your partner, but if you're facing a great recession, you're facing rising student debt, you're seeing that entry into home ownership is near impossible, and then you get whammed with COVID-19 pandemic, it may be hard to enact what you want, e.g., equity in childcare, employment, and housework when you're facing this economic headwind. So what this means is that we should, in theory, see this march towards greater equality across generations. And we should start to see men pick up the rest. If we look across housework time and childcare and employment, we should start to see generational differences across. So what does housework actually look like in, say, 1965? And what does the gender gap look like at this period of time? Well, I'm going to need you to sit down for a minute because I'm going to talk to you about weekly housework hours. This is per week. How many hours do women and men spend in housework? And if you look at the research by Susan Bianchi, Melissa Milkey, Liana Sayer, and John Robertson, published in Social Forces, it's this article called, Is Anyone Doing Housework? They were looking at what happened to housework time from 1965 to 1995. And what they found was that there was a closing of the gender gap in housework. In 1965, women on average spent 30 hours in housework per week compared to men's 4.9. For those of you who need help with the math, that is 6 times greater for women than men. In 1975, you start to see that women's housework time drops to 23.7 hours per week, and men's housework time does increase, 7.2. But again, we still have a threefold increase between women and men. By 1985, you start to see men doing 9.8 hours and women 19.7. Again, women are doing twice as much. And in 1995, you start to see that men do on average 10 and women 17.5 hours per week. So what we're seeing from 1965 to 1995 over 30 years is that men double their housework time. They go from doing 5 hours in 1965 to 10 in 1995. But what you see, the biggest changes are happening for women who are pretty much having their housework time. In 1965, they're doing 30. And by 1995, they do 17.5. So women have halved it and men have doubled it. But the base number is so much higher that you can see really the returns are coming from women doing less. Why are women doing less? Well, they're doing less because they're marrying later, they're entering their careers, they're having fewer children. And this is pretty critical, but you still see in this period of time in 1995, women do 17.5 hours for men's 10. So there's still this 7.5 hour gap. Now, I know what you're thinking. 1995 is a long time ago. What's happening today? So according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they're looking at the most recent estimates, which are coming in 2022. And we always have to think when we get in this COVID recovery time that these data can be a little bit weird, right? Because the world changed. And I'll talk to you about that in another podcast about what happened during COVID from our research. But in 2022, what the most recent statistics are showing is that on an average day, women are spending about 2.7 hours on household activities and men 2.2. You can see that this is close to parity, right? 2.7 and 2.2 per day. But when you think about that going across a week, and then when you think about that going across a year, that even really small differences in time, even if we have just say 0.5 of an hour or 30 minutes, when you go 30 minutes across 365 days, we're talking about hours and hours of time. So the gender gap is narrowing, but it definitely hasn't closed. And this gap is still significant. So generational gaps, is it in fact a misperception, right? That if we just wait over time, we'll start to see the gender gap close. Our data suggests no, it's not going to close it. That in fact, we're hitting maybe a threshold whereby there's not enough external support. There's not enough free childcare. There's not enough wage subsidy. There's not enough support for flexible work. There's not enough support for men to step into caregiving roles to actually move the dial past this moment. I mean, we can make arguments, of course, that we should be socializing boys to do more when they're young. I mean, that's fine. And there's a lot of research showing that, in fact, when we're parenting, we ask our girls to participate more in housework. That's shown. But I hate these individual solutions of like, it's up to mothers to socialize their children to be better, to solve gender equity issues. The answer is, yeah, of course we could ask our sons to do more and our daughters to do less. And yes, of course it's good to have them switch chores, right? To socialize young women into all types of chores, not just cleaning and cooking, but also household maintenance and yard work, and right, so they can have a diversity of skills. And yes, of course we should train boys to be more caring, more empathetic, to see unpaid work as real work, to see it as valuable work, and to help them step into that. That is just a true fact. We should do that. But what I don't like is this idea that mothers or families are solely responsible for that. What we should be doing is asking all institutions to value men's caregiving. We should be asking schools to help socialize kids into caring roles themselves, to give girls a diversity of experiences. And let's be honest, if we don't actually move the dial on the big stuff, the policy stuff, making childcare free, making sure that men have access to paid parental leave, making sure that if you ask for flexible work, you can get it, making sure that we're ensuring that those at the bottom have adequate wages to pay for everything, employment, groceries, housing, healthcare, childcare, aged care, et cetera, then we're not going to see anything shift on this. We're going to hit that stalled gender revolution. We're not going to see that additional 25 or 30% close. We're going to see those with the most resources are going to have the most options. And we're going to see that these gender gaps are going to remain across generations. Now, one of the critical things I want to say, and I've said this kind of across these podcasts, is that what we're doing is we're asking people to solve institutional problems by themselves. And we're asking them to increase their energy to do that alone. What I think is happening is we're just adding stuff on stuff on stuff. competing demands on competing demands on competing demands. And we need to think about this as a whole system approach. I'm going to talk about this in my book coming out in 2025, Drained, where we're looking at the impact of this on the mental load, because what I think is happening is that all this is doing is just straining people's mental loads, asking them to do more. In addition to the physical work, which we focus on for decades, we've told men for 50 years to start doing more housework, and they've done it. And we haven't talked to them about the other things that go around the housework, the mental load pieces, the organizational pieces. And so we need to start having that conversation. But I'll have that with you in 2025. Thank you very much. And the answer here is really about giving people back more control, more autonomy, more resources, and more time. If they have less time at work, that's really what I'm talking about. Less time at work, they can have more time to engage in some of the stuff that actually is really holistically good for the family. So, is it a misperception that our young women, our daughters, will close the chore gap? Absolutely. Are we individually responsible for doing this? Absolutely not. Do we require a whole of society structural approach to solving these problems? 100%. Do you want me to help you solve them? I am here. President of the United States, leaders of the world, call me. 044. Just kidding. I won't give you my full phone number, but that was the start. As per usual, thank you so much for being with me on Misperceived, where you don't need a PhD. You just get to come hang out with me. This podcast was produced with the support of the incredible Sophie Squires, the wonderful Kate Danger, the fantastic Rich Berner, and the one and only, the best ever made, Serena Reagan. I would like to acknowledge that our podcast is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today.